Hi, Philosophy of the Arts students. We will be continuing our conversation of Audre Lorde's Poetry and Thought with her essay, The Transformation of Silence into Language and Action, which is also a part of this collection of essay and speeches. So before we start discussing this essay, I want to point out that there are a lot of connections between poetry and death. So first of all, there's a number of poetic forms that are dedicated to either mourning the loss of someone who has died or thinking about the nature of death, or types of poetry that's meant to be sort of recited at a funeral. And we even have sort of epigraphs, right, on tombstones. So a lot of times poetry and this sort of poetic form are kind of surrounding part of our mourning process and how we cope and deal with death and loss. And then also, there's these sort of interesting anecdotes we have in the history of ideas where people have turned to poetry during their final days. So Socrates is famous for thinking that poets should be thrown outside of the ideal city that's ruled by the philosophers, because poetry can be used to kind of corrupt people because it plays with their emotions. And so he is creating this sort of utopian society, and he decides they need to kind of throw the poets out of it. And yet, when he's in prison and awaiting his own death, right, he's going to be executed by his city, he starts writing poetry in prison. So in his final days, he's turning to poetry as a sort of medium for thinking whatever he's thinking at the end of his life. And then we also have a lot of poems about death. One of the most famous is John Donne's Holy Sonnets. You might recognize the phrase, "Death, be not proud," which is one of the sonnets. So poetry in many ways ends up being this sort of way of meditating about the nature of death. And if you are in the mood for an excruciatingly painfully sad, tragic movie to watch, Wit is a 2001 movie with Emma Thompson, and she is actually a John Donne poet scholar. So she studies poetry in this, and she is diagnosed with stage 3 or stage 4 cancer. So she's dying of cancer starting from the first scene, and it goes through all the sort of excruciatingly painful aspects of cancer and cancer treatment and lying on your deathbed. And because she is someone who studied poetry, she's tying together sort of poetry and coming to terms with one's own mortality. So very hard movie to watch, but also very beautiful. And if you want to think more about the connections between death and poetry, I highly recommend this. So this is where Audre Lorde starts, is with a recognition of her own mortality at the beginning of the transformation of silence into language and action. So she starts out by talking about receiving this sort of going to the doctor and having to have a biopsy and knowing that there's a 60 to 80% chance that she has breast cancer. So she's coming to terms with the fact that she might have cancer. And she writes of sort of coming to terms with her own mortality and the sort of feeling she has around the idea that she might die of cancer. So she says, "In becoming forcibly and essentially aware of my mortality and of what I wished and wanted for my life, however short it might be, priorities and omissions became strongly etched in a merciless light." Right? So she's saying, I'm thinking, very intensely about my life right now because it might be coming to an end. And I'm thinking about what I've prioritized, what I've put my energy into, what I've done. And I'm thinking of what I've failed to do, what I might not have time to do anymore. And she says, I see this in this merciless light because I'm coming to the end of my life, right? Possibly coming to the end of my life. And so when everything's thrown into relief, when everything's kind of under this intense light of your death, what she sees most is her silences, right? What I regretted most were my silences. So when she's thinking about what she regrets and what she has not yet done, the thing that stands out is when she did not speak. She says, "Of what had I ever been afraid? To question or to speak as I believed could have meant pain or death." Right? So she's saying, my silences were caused by fear, right? I'm afraid that if I spoke out, if I spoke up on behalf of myself and expressed these sort of feelings, that I might have had consequences, that maybe someone would hurt me, maybe I would have died. Maybe, my words would have led to some sort of violence against me. This is something she has to worry about as a Black woman in America, right? Not just a Black woman, but a queer Black woman in America. So she says, but we all hurt in so many different ways all the time. And pain will either change or end, right? So she's aware that there's a cost to speaking, there's some pain, but she says everything is pain. Being silent is a pain, just as suffering the consequences of your speech are a pain. But death, on the other hand, is the final silence. So she will be in pain as long as she's alive, no matter what she does, whether she stays silent or she speaks out. But death erases all that. Death is sort of the end of everything, the end of all the possibilities, the end of speech, the end of having anything to say, the end of people hearing you and seeing you and, people witnessing you. And so death ends all of that. It ends up sort of equalizing all risk. So she says, and by that she means death, or this final silence, might be coming quickly now, right? She's anticipating this sort of cancer diagnosis without regard for whether I had ever spoken what needed to be said or had only betrayed myself into small silences while I planned someday to speak or waited for someone else's words, right? So she's regretting all these moments where she didn't speak and she either betrayed herself by being silent or she was waiting for someone else to say what needed to be said. And I began to recognize a source of power within myself that comes from the knowledge that while it is most desirable not to be afraid, learning to put fear into perspective gave me great strength, right? So she knows she can't get rid of that fear, right? We all feel that, especially when we're speaking our deepest truths, when we're trying to tell people who we are, especially if we're in a vulnerable or oppressed position. That's very hard to do. And so there's always going to be some fear there. But she says that if you can't, have no fear, the next best thing is to put that fear into perspective, right? And one of the ways we can put fear into perspective is that maybe we're afraid because we're seeing something really important, something that needs to be said. And maybe there's a great risk there. There's a sort of danger, particularly the things she has to say, right? As a Black woman, as a gay woman, as someone who's trying to fight the way things are and create change in the world, right? She has a great deal to risk. But that fear, in a way, shouldn't be the obstacle. It's a sort of starting place for what she has to say. She goes on to say, what are the words you do not yet have? What do you need to say? What are the tyrannies you swallow day by day and attempt to make your own until you will sicken and die of them still in silence? Right, so this is really, she's poetically and kind of beautifully describing what it feels to be put into silence or to feel forced into silence, and to kind of feel the tyranny of being silenced and unheard and not have your words sort of resonate in the world. So she knows that she has to overcome the silence. She knows that this is going to be what she wants to do with the remaining life that she has, is to speak and to speak powerfully. And she tells her daughter, you have to speak. You can't be a whole person if you remain silent. And she says that if you don't speak, if you keep ignoring what you want to say, this part of you inside gets madder and madder and hotter and hotter. And if you don't speak it out one day, it will just jump up and punch you in the mouth from the inside, right? So, if we don't express who we are, if we don't let that part of us kind of out and find words and express that and communicate that, right? We're kind of trapped. We're like imprisoned, and that person inside is going to get so angry that it might pop out in unexpected ways and unwanted ways. And so she's talking about the need to kind of transform silence into language and action in a way that's meaningful and intentful. And that requires courage and vulnerability, but it's going to come out in some way. And we want it to come out in a way that is meaningfully who we are and what we want to do. And this doesn't mean you get rid of that fear. Speaking doesn't mean that fear is gone. Right? She says, of course I am afraid, because the transformation of silence into language and action is an act of self-revelation, and that always seems fraught with danger. So I want you to think about why this is so dangerous to speak. Why is it dangerous to take the things that we're silent about? And if we're thinking, what are you silent about? It's usually what you're afraid to say, your deepest truths, your most deepest, darkest vulnerabilities, or the things that are most painful to you, or situations where you feel like you don't have the power to speak, which is usually when you most need to speak. And so those moments aren't just about saying what needs to be said, but it's also coming to terms with yourself, kind of putting yourself out there. And when you put yourself out there, you make yourself very visible, you make yourself very vulnerable, and that's very dangerous. So she says, in the case of silence, each of us draws the face of her own fear of contempt, of censure, or some judgment or recognition, of challenge, of annihilation, right? So when we're silent, there's many different things we're afraid of. Maybe we're afraid of other people's contempt, that they'll look down on us. We're afraid of being censored, of people saying we said something bad. We're afraid of just people's judgments, right? If I say something, then I am subjecting myself to the judgment of other people. They now can form these opinions of me based on my words. Or maybe I'm afraid of being challenged. I say something and someone wants to oppose me, and maybe I'm not ready or feel strong enough to sort of meet that challenge to my ideas and thoughts. Maybe I'm afraid of total annihilation, that if I put myself out there, I will be destroyed. So there's so many reasons I can kind of wrap myself up in silence and not speak. And she says, but most of all, I think we fear the visibility without which we cannot truly live. This is a very sort of profound statement, right? All the things she listed before are clearly negative, right? Annihilation, judgment, censure. Of course, I'm afraid of those things. But being visible, right? Especially the visibility we need to live. Why are we afraid of that, right? In a way, I think she's saying that we're afraid of exposing ourselves, right? We need people to recognize us. That's part of Maslow's hierarchy of needs, right? Social relationships require others to recognize and see who we are. And if we're in a relationship with someone who doesn't really see our true self, where they have just kind of a projection of us or a false image of us, or kind of fit us into some sort of box, right? That's a deep pain. We don't get what we need out of that relationship because we don't receive the recognition we need. So we need to be visible, and we need to be seen as who we truly are in how we relate to other people. That's a genuine need we have. We can't live without it, as Audre Lorde says. And so we need to speak, and we need to show ourselves. But that doesn't make it any easier just because we need that, right? So she's saying we have to draw ourselves out of our silence and put ourselves out there and be visible. But that doesn't mean that's not sort of a scary thing to do. She says that visibility makes us most vulnerable is that which is also the source of our greatest strength, right? So we're so afraid of it because it requires, saying who you are, being speaking from the things we're afraid to speak about, like turning our silence into language, is something that makes us very vulnerable, but also speaking from that vulnerability is going to be our greatest strength. right? And I'm sure you felt this before, like that moment when you finally reveal who you truly are to someone, or you finally say something and it really is what you think and feel. It's scary, but you also feel deeply empowered by it. She says, the machine will try to grind you into dust anyway, whether or not we speak. We can sit in our corners mute forever while our sisters and ourselves are wasted, while our children are distorted and destroyed, while our earth is poisoned. We can sit in our safe corners mute as bottles and we will still be no less afraid. Right, so this is a really important point she's making, is she's like, well, speaking, that is a source of fear. Speaking up is always going to require a great deal of courage. But being silent doesn't get rid of the fear. It's not like being silent fixes the issue. It's like, do you want to suffer in silence, or do you want to kind of confront that fear and be courageous? And the fear doesn't go away, but at least you're doing something about it, right? At least you're not sort of, um, cowering in the corner. So she talks a lot about having this sort of commitment to the power of language. And that's something she talked about in Poetry is Not a Luxury too, right? Language is so powerful. Finding the words for ideas, finding the words for our feelings, transforming them into actions is this enormous power that we have the capacity for through our ability to speak and use language. And so she really talks a lot about reclaiming language in this essay and how to use language to share meanings, to share experiences, to let your voice be heard. And for her, this isn't just about, people listening to what you have to say. She says this is vital to life. This is about survival. This is about living. And not just sort of living at a bare minimum, but living in a way that generates new things. So growing creatively is for her based in language. So she ends this kind of essay by talking about sort of not just speaking from her own truths, but wanting to connect to other communities. She's not just speaking for Black women, she's speaking to everyone. She wants everyone to be a part of this message and to hear her. And she says that it is not differences which immobilize us, but silence. So it's not that we all have to kind of become the same person, or that our differences and having different types of experiences mean that we can't come together or that we can't communicate across these differences. For her, it's really silence that creates division. And so she wants to kind of us to use a language as this revolutionary and as this extremely powerful medium for creating positive social change in the world. And that's really important to her mission. So I have posted one of her poems, A Woman Speaks, and you can hear her reading it in her own voice. And I want you to listen to her voice and how powerful it is. And I want you to think about this essay and what sort of silences is she giving voice to? How is she speaking her truth? How is this her using language to express who she is, and where is the sort of vulnerability there? So this is what I would like you to think about for this week, and I hope you enjoy Audre Lorde's poetry, and I'm looking forward to what you have to say on the discussion boards. Thank you so much.